Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We are here with the one and only Jake. Am I saying this right? Ade or
A
Ade?
day, yeah.
Ade, Jake Ade. He's a PhD from UCSF, the Department of Psychiatry. He's been writing quite a bit on psychedelics. We're going to go through some of the articles and papers that he's been digging into, and it's going to be a wild ride. He's written pretty extensively on a lot of interesting subjects, so I'm excited to talk to him today. Jake, thanks for being here, man. Is there anything else that I left out in your bio right there?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about the field and yeah, answer any questions you have about any of my papers or just the field generally. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think maybe we could paint a little bit of background by saying that a lot of your work focuses on cognitive and the social effects of psychedelics, as well as improving research methodology and safety with drugs. So, you know what? One of the papers you wrote talked about it talked about the long-term effects of psychedelic drugs. And in
Yeah.
conjunction, before you start your answer, I was playing with Chat GPT yesterday, and I want to read to you what Chat GPT told me about long-term psilocybin. And then I would like to hear maybe your rebuttal, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about what you have learned from the long-term effects of psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting to hear what the chat came up with.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. So I heard prompting is like, it's worth its weight in gold if you can prompt the computer the right way. So here's
Yeah,
my
that's what I've
question.
heard.
Act as a neuroscientist, a shaman, and an ethnobotanist to predict the long-term effects of long-term high-dose psilocybin on the brain, behavior, and evolution. And here's what it kicked back to me. As a neuroscientist, long-term high dose of psilocybin can lead to changes in brain structure and function, specifically affecting neuroplasticity, synaptic connectivity, and the regulation of neurotransmitter systems involved in cognition and emotional processing. However, there is limited research on the long-term effects of high-dose psilocybin use, and more studies are needed to fully understand its impact on the brain. So pretty good for a neuroscientist, right? I mean, or for
Yeah,
ChatGPT. So
that's
I thought
pretty.
that was interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, that's solid and conservative enough that I'm comfortable with it. Yeah, because we really don't know much about the long-term effects on the brain yet of psychedelics. That paper you're referencing, the long-term effects of psychedelics, was published in 2020, and there wasn't a single long-term neuroimaging paper at that point published. So like all of the stuff that's come out has just been the last couple years. So it's like very new, and we're very much still starting to prod that area of what's actually happening in the brain long after the acute effects of the drug have worn off. In that review paper, I think there was one study that did a neuroimaging test the next day, but it's not really a long-term follow-up by any means. And yeah, some of the the big neuroscientists in this area have started to address this recently in the last couple of years. Robin Carhart Harris's group has done some post-acute neuroimaging findings and looking at brain modularity specifically. And the Hopkins group has been doing some long-term imaging work too. So yeah, it's starting to come out now, but still very new. So I like that the chat was kind of general and broad about what might be happening in the brain. That's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah, they did a good job of compiling some papers, and in a weird way, it's sort of an alternative to searching for things, but it puts it in a nice, digestible format that you can kind of play with a little bit. I'm wondering, like, do you think that is it possible that the long-term effects of the psychedelics can have lifetime effects? Like, would it be possible to maybe, I think you had written in a previously paper, can psychedelic drugs attenuate age-related changes in cognition? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought the paper out. It doesn't get talked about too much, so yeah, thanks. It was actually something I initially wrote for a developmental psychology class in grad school, and then ended up developing it into a little bit more of a fleshed out paper and tried to actually publish it eventually, and we did. Yeah, it's there's definitely some people who report effects that are permanent seemingly after a psychedelic use. Either whether that's changes in personality, whether that's changes in just how they look at the world, how they just feel day to day. There's not everybody, of course. It's not a panacea, and some people feel better for a little bit and then rebound, but others do seem to have this permanent change in their psyche, and so yeah, I do think there are some individuals where they could have long lasting effects. With older adults specifically, I think that's a really interesting area of research to explore, and it's been pretty understudied. Um, but we do know that if you can take some strategies early in life to improve your mood and your cognition, that there's tons of downstream effects that can be gained from that. And so, addressing your depression in your 20s and your 30s can reduce your chances of Alzheimer's later. And so, if you have a very powerful psychedelic experiences that, addresses your depression, then seemingly, maybe that could benefit you long term down the line in terms of some things that you might not expect or think about when you're, taking the drug. And then also, there's the question of older adults themselves taking the drugs, which is pretty interesting as well. The research is pretty conservative when it's starting out, and there's a lot of age limits on a lot of studies. Some of the end of life distress studies obviously got around that, and so there is some precedent for older adults being incorporated into the research. But I think they are kind of underrepresented, and there are some unique considerations too for that population.
Yeah. Do we like? So obviously I'm not a doctor of any means. I'm just an enthusiast. I love reading and participating, exploring and experimenting and coming up with some ideas. And so, but from your perspective, do we know like what is happening in there? Is there is there being like a dump of neurotransmitters? People talk about the default mode network kind of being turned off and processing different information in different regions of the brain. Or when it comes to psilocybin, do we know, what do we know about what's going on in the brain?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Like I mentioned before, we're still kind of in the beginnings of this area of research, but we do know that for sure that psilocybin attaches to serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, and those receptors are pretty widely distributed in the cortex, most densely in areas like the frontal lobe, medial prefrontal cortex. And we know that the psychedelics work on the 5-HT2A receptor for a couple of different reasons. First, if you block the 2A receptor and then give somebody a psychedelic, they're not going to have any trip or any psychoactive effects. So that's pretty telling. Also, drugs that have greater potency or greater affinity, I should say, for the 5-HT2A receptor. So they're able to find that receptor better than other drugs. Those ones with the higher affinity have more potency. So you only need to take a smaller amount of them to get the same effects. So for example, LSD has a much higher affinity for the 2A receptor than psilocybin. And so because of that, you take less LSD than you would need to take of psilocybin to get the same effect. And so we really have a lot of converging evidence that the 2A receptor is really the most important, signaling pathway for psychedelics. There's others that are involved, but the 2A is really at the heart of it. And there's a lot of things we know about the 2A receptor outside of psychedelics. It seems to be a really important receptor in plasticity and responding to changes in your environment. And we know things like chronic stress sensitize the 2A receptor. And because of that, when you're in a chronic stressed environment, you need to be able to adapt and to be plastic. And so there's a lot of different evidence suggesting that the 2A receptor is related to plasticity. And so when somebody takes a psychedelic, what we're thinking is happening is that there's these changes in plasticity where the brain's able to make new connections through these 2A signaling pathways. And this is going to disrupt hierarchically organized brain activity. And because of that, you're going to have deeply ingrained thoughts, patterns, and behaviors possibly disrupted. And, that allows a chance for people to look at their problems from a new perspective, and potentially for some of these insights and epiphanies to stick long after the experience has gone away because of those changes in plasticity.
That's so fascinating to me. It's I recently heard someone say that psychedelics remove memory from perception. And I thought to myself, wow, that was a really astute way to put it. And it may not be 100% accurate, but it's a good way for someone to get an understanding of what's going on. And I think that would lead to some pretty incredible insights if we just think about how conditioned we've been since the age of 2, since we began using language and we began labeling things. If you can just have this 45-minute or this 3-hour experience where everything that you remembered about something is kind of glossed over, and you get to see it anew and make new connections to it. Like that can be so beneficial for people that have, I mean, just regular day people, but specifically for people that are struggling. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that totally resonates with me. People really do get stuck in these ruts, and especially in things like depression, but also in things like substance misuse disorders, where there's just kind of this monotony and this kind of never changing, it seems like, of their patterns of behavior. And so a chance to see things in a new light or from a new perspective be really powerful, I think, for some people. And like you said, it's not just clinical populations. I think that could be pretty meaningful for, just everyday people as well. I mean, I think that's not a good way of putting it. Individuals without psychiatric disorders. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, so I think that's something people are starting to explore, is looking at healthy populations. We have a study here at UCSF where we're, studying a healthy population, giving them psilocybin or psilocin, and we're looking at a lot of their different outcomes, their social functioning and their cognitive functioning, specifically things like their relationships with their family, their social values, their levels of gratitude, their social support networks, and then in terms of cognition, looking at things like cognitive flexibility and creativity, all of things that are, pretty beneficial to one's health, even if you don't have a diagnosis of something. So yeah, we're hoping that there can be a lot of applications there.
Yeah, those are all great points. And it brings me to I think you've written quite a bit on the world of clinical trials. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to add into what you just said. You're talking about, giving some everyday people psilocin or certain doses of a psychedelic in order to monitor their relationships and stuff like that. But how do we get to this conundrum of measuring objective research from subjective research? Because it seems to me like a lot of the subjective stuff is really important. There are some things that you can't really, put a needle on or put on a scale, but like they're important. Like, how do we get around that?
Yeah, it's tough. It's a great point. And I think it's not like one solution. It's kind of being open to a lot of different approaches and a lot of different ways of evaluating evidence. So, I think having qualitative studies can really complement clinical trials where, we have actual interviews with the participants, and you write about the themes that came up in those interviews. Some things it's great if you can have some kind of objective measure, like a biomarker or a behavioral test, that seems to keep the scientists a little happier when you're trying to publish these papers. But like you said, it's not always possible to be able to get a behavioral measure of their relationships or how close they feel to others. You can't really capture that with a reaction time necessarily. You can try to capture it on 1 to 10 Likert scales or whatever, but it's not going to be a very clean translation, and there's going to be a lot of nuance that gets lost too. So I think it's important to not get too siloed into your one methodology, and to really be open to different ways of evaluating the evidence.
Yeah, on another sort of slice of testing things and trials, it's always fascinating to me to get to hear the trip reports or the accounts of what happens. And there's so much spirituality that seems to be wrapped up in the world of changing ideas. And that can be a scary thing, I think, especially for the world of science. But for me, it seems that, and this is just my words, it seems to me that science and spirituality are opposite sides of the same coin. And I feel like we're moving back towards that. And when you have this subjective experience you're trying to explain, it's almost ineffable. You can't really explain it, but that's that spiritual side. And sometimes I think that scares science. Like, whoa, we're not moving backwards here. We're supposed to be going forward. Do you see like a sort of weird kind of thing happening there?
Yeah, it kind of calls back to the early days of psychology when behaviorism kind of rose, and like behaviorists were like, no, we don't want to study the mind at all because we can't see it, we can't measure it. We're just going to ignore it and pretend it's not there and focus on what we can, objectively observe. And I think there's a lot of parallels there. But I think it's a duty of science to kind of try to challenge itself and to answer those questions, and to really push the boundaries of what we know, and to not just give up essentially and say, no, that's just kind of outside of our realm. I think definitely a tough thing it's a tough nut to crack, but it's something that we can iteratively learn about and make improvements on.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Coming from the world of psychiatry, there seems to be, you know, my family has gone through a lot of turmoil, like all families. And we probably all know people who have gone through different mental illnesses and been around different things. And it seems to me that, people that have mental illness, sometimes they find a path back to feeling better through religion, or they can find a path back through, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that prior to psychedelics, it seems to me that religion was a crutch for people to find their way back to a life worth living. But it seems to
Sure.
me psychedelics are also doing that. So, I guess I'm still talking a little bit about the spiritual in that. Like, we have this religion system in our minds, and it seems that psychedelics like trigger that on some level. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting point to make. Yeah, it seems like maybe psychedelics are kind of emerging as like an alternative to
Yeah.
religion in some cases, in terms of being able to get out of like a substance use disorder or a big rut in your life. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about and why that might be. Obviously rates of religiosity are declining in the U.S. and
Yeah.
there's a lot of people. Very generally, it seems like people have a lot of issues with organized religion, and so I could see when somebody gets to adulthood, they obviously have a lot of baggage there. No matter who you are, you have
Yeah.
preconceptions, you have biases, you have thoughts about religion. It's impossible to avoid. And so I think having this kind of other option that's kind of a parallel but doesn't have the same baggage and is at the same time being hyped up by scientists and the news media and basically celebrities and everybody too. That's suddenly very attractive, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that brings us to, I mean, yet another paper that you've written about psychedelic drugs and perception. Like, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I started on that paper because when I began my PhD, I was actually doing more attention and perception research. Um, and then during the first semester, I took a history of psychology class, and it was taught by my advisor. And he let me write a paper on the history of psychedelics and LSD specifically. And um, you know, it did really well. We ended up publishing it actually. And so suddenly he was like, maybe we can make this a line of research in our lab. So the next step seemed to be, synthesizing the things that we were doing in the lab with the psychedelic area. And so we are like, what's been done on psychedelics and perception? Um, and so, yeah, we found that there's not much research that had been coming out in the more recent years because it was more clinically oriented, but that there was this kind of huge body of research from the 50s and 60s on the perceptual effects of psychedelics that really wasn't synthesized at all. It was very just kind of all over the place. And, especially because these articles came out, 50, 60 years ago now, they're kind of hard to track down and find a lot of the times, especially if you're not looking for them. And so, yeah, we thought it'd be useful to just synthesize that really huge body of literature. And, I think it was actually a little too much to take on, to be honest. It was a little bit too broad of a scope for the paper. So it did take a very long time to get that published and to actually write it. But I think it was pretty interesting. Yeah, we got to cover just every different sensory modality, essentially. As you might expect, visual processing had the most research on it and seemed to be perceptual domain that people had the most robust changes in perception. Surprisingly, but there was research on other perceptual modalities as well, though. So people did sometimes report auditory hallucinations or auditory distortions under the influence of psychedelics. Um, Changes in body schema, that was another thing that was pretty interesting because we didn't think anybody had really measured that very much, and that was something my advisor was interested in, was doing body schema research. And so, yeah, some people feel this kind of loss of their sense of their physical body. They tend to feel like they're kind of merging with their surroundings, which is something that kind of comes up in meditation too. So that was something we were really interested in. We actually did a meditation study on that, looking at how to kind of track those changes in boundaries with EEG measures, which is pretty cool to study. And then there were also some olfactory changes, but not very much. There's a couple of people that reported, smelling things that weren't there, or distorted smells and distorted taste as well. But yeah, that was the kind of the broad overview of the paper, I suppose. Yeah. And
So if
time
we go back,
perception, lastly, too, that was also altered.
if we go back to the meditation and the EEG studies and psychedelics, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Are you measuring brain waves, or like what's going on in that study?
Yeah, absolutely. So the brain generates a variety of cognitive maps to represent the surrounding environment around us. And so that you know where, the bathroom is in your house, even though you're not thinking about it, you know where the upstairs is. You know how to get to your kitchen, where your drink is, without thinking about those things. Those things are all going on in the mind without you thinking about them. And one map that the brain makes is called peripersonal space. And it's not something that many people are familiar with. But peripersonal space is essentially the region around your body within arm's length, essentially a bubble around your body. And we know this is a true map in the brain from a variety of different imaging studies. This is even in monkeys. They can do single cell recordings and see that certain neurons fire when things are in that bubble versus when they're not. And so essentially the brain prioritizes the space around the body, which makes sense, right? You want to be able to take care of what's around your body first in the environment, especially in the evolutionary sense. And because we have that cognitive map that prioritizes the space around us, we actually have attentional and perceptual benefits for things that are occurring in that space. So you actually see things better if they're in that map space. You actually can respond to them quicker, and things like that. And so the peripersonal space seems to be a really important bodily boundary. We were wondering if that bodily boundary is one thing that gets either deprioritized or shrinks when people are under the influence of meditation, or expands as we weren't really sure the direction, because people often report this sense of merging with their surroundings and a loss of kind of their personal bubble, essentially.
Yeah.
And you can track peripersonal space with EEG. So stimuli within peripersonal space are going to elicit a higher P3 amplitude, which is a type of EEG signal, which is related to essentially attentional salience. So if something elicits a higher P3, it captures your attention more. And we see that things within the peripersonal space elicit a greater P3 than things that are outside. Just another marker that this space is prioritized and considered special by the brain. And so what we did is we measured their peripersonal space bubbles before meditation and after meditation. And we found that after meditating, people's peripersonal bubbles shrunk so that they were actually a little bit smaller. And we were thinking that this might be one thing underlying their phenomenological changes in bodily boundaries as well. But definitely need more research on that. And this is not something we really followed up, unfortunately, because I moved on to the psychedelic space more, and they took on a graduate student who's interested in other things. But it was a kind of interesting finding that tied into the psychedelic stuff in some ways.
That is fascinating, Jake. I've never heard that. I've read quite a bit. I've never heard anything about that. And all the time I hear about, boundary dissolution and stuff like that, but that really kind of brings it home. And that would be a fascinating study to do on psychedelics or different psychedelics. And so is it when you're reading the EKG, is it an EKG or EEG?
EEG, yeah.
So when you're reading the EEG, is it brain waves throughout the entire brain, or different parts of the brain that you're reading?
That's a great question. Yeah. So when you're trying to localize the P3, you can look at specific electrodes, or you can collapse specific electrodes and kind of average them. We were looking at a specific one towards the back of the head here. Yeah.
And is that where the map is at, or?
We don't really know, I guess. With EEG, you can't get much spatial resolution because you're measuring electrical signals from the brain, right? And so the electrical signals have to go through your skull, and then they reach the electrodes on top. And so there's a huge loss of clarity in the signal in terms of spatial resolution. So you're not able to localize activity with EEG very well. However, the timing is very precise because electrical activity is so fast. So you get, hundreds of ratings a second. Whereas with fMRI, it relies on blood flow, which is a much slower process than electricity. And so, the resolution, the temporal resolution with fMRI would be something like you get a sample every couple seconds, like 2 to 3 seconds, whereas with EEG, you're getting hundreds of measures every single second. So there's trade-offs between the two. But with fMRI, you can get much better spatial resolution and see actually where changes are happening better.
And was that EEG? Was it like were those waves like alpha or beta? Were they big waves, small waves, or like the dream state, or is that relevant?
So this is like a ERP, an event-related potential. So this would be different than
Okay.
like a wave, essentially. This
Okay.
would be a signal that's evoked by a specific stimulus. Yeah.
Okay. It's so fascinating to me, and uh, there was another paper, again, because you've written tons of them, and thank you for writing them because they're very fascinating to read.
I appreciate it. Thank you a lot.
Yeah. And for those watching or listening to this, his name's Jacob S. Ade, PhD. You can look him up on ResearchGate and check out the papers. They're really worthwhile, and you could probably reach out to him. He'd probably love to talk to you. So
Yeah, absolutely.
You've done some other interesting papers on pupil dilation. And I have this idea that I wanted to run by you, and this is just pure speculation, but I wanted to get a professional's thought about it. And so my thought was that, on LSD and sometimes psilocybin, I find that my pupils are incredibly dilated.
Yeah,
And
of course.
when you look at your pupils, I think of my pupil like a shutter on a camera. And if you're shooting in camera raw, like you're getting all this light in. And
Yeah.
we've seen all these new studies about light has memory, and it just seems like you're processing so much more because you're getting so much more in. Are you processing more? Is it a way to like? I feel like you're seeing more when your pupils are very dilated, and I'm wondering if long-term pupil dilation has anything to do with, processing more information and understanding more of the environment around you. What do you think about that? Is that just out there or what?
No, it's interesting. Yeah, it's something that I don't know a whole lot about, to be honest. Yeah, no, and I see what you're saying. I think that yeah, there's definitely merit to that. I guess what I could say for sure is that when your pupils dilate, you're letting more light in. Of course, more rods are being stimulated, and so you're gonna have more saturated colors, more visual acuity, essentially. My research on the eye has been more in looking at social gaze and seeing how eye size and pupil size affect social gaze and attention. So that was what I was doing during my master's degree before I got into psychedelic research. So yeah, I started doing like emotion and attention research, then started doing attention and perception research, and then shifted to psychedelics. But yeah, before, what I was looking at is um, how different emotional expressions and the morphology of the eye changes, and how that influences attention. So we know that emotional facial expressions, like fearful facial expressions, capture attention more than a neutral expression, and you can measure that a number of different ways. But if you have, there's the most basic test of that is the dot probe task, where it's a computer task. There's a central fixation point they stare at, and then two faces are briefly shown, one on each side of the cross. One would be fearful, one would be neutral. They'd only be up for like 100 milliseconds and disappear, and then a target comes up behind one of them. And what we see is that when the target's behind the fearful face, people respond faster than when it's behind the neutral face. And the reason for that is because they have an attention bias towards the spatial region where there was a fearful stimulus or a threatening stimulus. And that's an evolutionary adaptation to respond to emotional stimuli quicker in your environment. But there's some nuance there as well. So we found that in one of our studies that the degree to which sclera exposure was shown, so sclera is the white portion of the eye, it influenced the degree to which people oriented towards emotional spatial expressions and towards fearful stimuli. And so the thinking is that the more white is shown in a fearful expression, the easier it is to see where they're looking, and that facilitates quicker responses. And supporting that, we see that creatures and animals that have more sclera exposure typically are more social and would use that kind of gaze orienting communication more often.
It's fascinating to think about. Most people, or at least me, I never thought about what effects the sclera would have on my decision making or communication, but it's a fascinating thing to get into. How much actual communication is happening with the eyes, and especially in today's world where it seems like we're all focused on a screen, and
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
it's weird to think. I wonder if you were to speculate, do you think that this is just kind of on a side note, but if you were to speculate, do you think that the world of communication is becoming, even though it's easier for you and I to talk, you know, via the platform, what do you think are the long-term effects of communication these days? It seems like we're not in person as much. What would you speculate is happening to our communication?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely some detriments to our communication that are being lost through the virtual interactions. In our lab here at UCSF, I could see that you know when people get together in the lab and in person, like there's just so many more opportunities to get to know each other informally. Just a little walks down the hallway or whatever, getting between rooms. Um, you don't get that when everyone's meeting in a Zoom room, and the little pauses before meetings and after meetings. You can't really have little chats in an open Zoom room because everybody's listening essentially, and it's just awkward to have a one-on-one conversation with 30 people and just sitting in the background. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot that's been lost there. And then one other thing that you made me think of is masks, because a lot of our nonverbal communication also relies on the lower portion of our face as well. Our smiles and our frowns, and that those also involve the lower portions of our face. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about maybe what's happened with our nonverbal communication over the last few years when people have been relying on the eye region more than ever. And also, communicating not face to face anymore. You got to think that that's those things, two things together, have really radically changed how we interact with each other. And even if it's in some subtle ways that we don't notice all the time, and it's kind of happened gradually over time, I think there probably has to be some changes there.
Yeah, it makes me think of like the World Series of Poker. Like those guys are always trying to cover up their entire face. It's like COVID in some level is perfect for them because like I got to wear a mask and my glasses. I don't want anyone to see my face. If you think about it, some of those guys are masters of facial communication or reading facial tics and eye contact and
Yeah.
small smirks on the smile and nostril flares and things like that. It's kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's true. Very attuned to the nonverbal signals. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this is just me speculating, but prior to us starting, we had mentioned that psychedelics are becoming such a broad aspect of study that we could almost use psychedelics in every field of exploration, like whether it's artwork or sports or what do you think would be some other exciting things to study in different fields with psychedelics? If you could, if I gave you unlimited money, Jake, and you could do a study on psychedelics in any field, what would it be?
Oh man, that's a big question.
It is a big question. Take a moment there to think about it.
Yeah. Man, I guess. Yeah, I guess I have pretty particular interest in just the broader like, pro-social effects psychedelics can have. Not necessarily the clinical applications, but the degree to which people can feel more connected to nature and to the universe more broadly. I'd like to see how to facilitate that. Most of these clinical trials have happened in laboratories, in hospitals, and very they try to pretty up the room a little bit, but it's still kind of synthetic and sterile. So I would love to go to like Yosemite or something and do a study there. Give people psychedelics in a very awe-inducing nature environment. See if we can really, just really hammer in that connection to nature aspect of it, and really kind of hone in on it, and try to, just facilitate that by throwing as many bells and whistles on it as possible. I suppose in some ways people are kind of doing this with these retreats in Central and South America. They're going into the jungle and obviously not taking it in a synthetic or sterile environment at all. So we see that from the naturalistic studies of people doing that people do often benefit and feel more connected to nature. So yeah, I think there is some precedent there, but I would love to take what we've learned from the clinical trials and combine it with what we know from those naturalistic studies, and just really do a really souped up version of a psychedelic nature intervention. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, that leads me to the idea of, James Fadiman wrote a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And in that book, he invited everyone to be like a citizen scientist in a way. Like he invited everyone to write down the things that have happened to you when you're microdosing and send it into his website. And it just, it seems if we take that and we pair it with the world of decentralization that seems to be emerging today, might we be on the precipice of decentralizing clinical trials? Like, why couldn't the people at the retreats be writing down information? Why couldn't the people that are like you and I be writing down our information? And I realize that there's a lot of subjectivity there, but isn't there also subjectivity in the actual clinical trials? Do you think it's possible for us to get away from this really rigid clinical trial setup and somehow decentralize it in a way that would democratize it, make it, so more people could, just with the sheer amount of information, I got to think that there's some real good nuggets in there for us to learn from. What do you think about, is it possible to decentralize clinical trials in some way?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really cool idea. I think there still needs to be like, scientists involved,
Right.
kind of
Absolutely.
overseeing and, planning it, and, because there still needs to be some structure to it, and things need to be collected in some kind of systematic way still. But I don't think we need to rely on clinical trials as the only way to gather that evidence for sure. And I can tell you myself from my experience doing both naturalistic studies and clinical trials that, there's trade-offs. So, I did a ayahuasca naturalistic study for my dissertation where I just, gave people surveys that were attending an ayahuasca retreat in Costa Rica, the week before they went, the week after they went, and the month after they went. And there weren't really any cost to the study other than, paying the participants, which, I did a raffle, and a certain number of participants won a certain amount of money. And collectively, it was like under $1,000. So like the month that I gave away to the participants. And now I'm doing a clinical trial that's, approaching like $1 million. And so the scale there in terms of the cost is enormous. What you're getting out of it maybe is not as, there's maybe not as much of a gap between that. So I think there is, ways to make the most of your money and to not just rely on clinical trials, because you can get really useful information from much cheaper methods as well. And, what's interesting is with the clinical trials is everybody knows that the participants are unblinded, right? So it's not even a real double-blind trial. And so we're essentially, getting almost the same quality of evidence at these naturalistic retreats for really a fraction of the cost. Obviously, you still want some kind of control group if you can as well. But in terms of, blinding, that's not happening anyways with clinical trials. So that's, I think there's a lot to gain from not just being myopically focused on clinical trials. Yeah.
Yeah, I talk to a lot of people that are beginning to establish retreats, and some people have some really cool ideas. Like this, there's a company called Wake, and what they are doing, they're partnering with people to try to utilize different, brainwave technology or the EEGs to figure out ways in which to, try to pin down exactly what's happening and then compare that evidence and stuff. But one of my questions to them, and I'll pose the same question to you, is, do you think some things get lost in cultural translation? Like, let's say me from, Caucasian Acres goes down to Brazil, and I'm listening to these Icaros and these beautiful sounds, but it's like I'm going to Spanish 5 and trying to participate in the class. Like, I don't speak Spanish. I mean, I speak Spanish, but maybe I don't speak Italian.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
if you go to another country and you try to listen to the lecture, you may be picking out words, but you're not thinking in that culture. So I'm wondering, you know, might there be a big difference between someone who does an ayahuasca ceremony in a traditional Hito in Brazil versus someone that does a ayahuasca ceremony in a Christian church in Iowa? Do you think there might be some differences there just because of the culture? And what would be the benefits and negatives on that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So we know for sure that there are a lot of non-pharmacological aspects in psychedelics that influence people's effects, and that the set and setting are very
Yeah.
important. That's something that's kind of dogma in the field, essentially.
Yeah.
We know that this is true. And so, yeah, so that being the case, there has to be some differences in these people's outcomes, I would think. I would in terms of benefits and detriments to each of those two approaches, I'm not sure exactly. I think there's probably something to be said for all the work that goes into
Yeah.
going down into South
Yeah.
America and Central America to do these retreats. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there where, um, you're telling yourself, oh, I'm taking all this time off, I'm spending all this money, I'm going through this huge hassle to go out down there. I better get better, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's kind of that unconscious aspect of it, of cognitive dissonance, where I wouldn't be doing these things if it wasn't going to
Right.
make me better, right? And so, yeah, the more effort you put into something, kind of unintuitively, the more likely it is to actually benefit you. But yeah, but also, there's that method I just described also came out at a lot of cost too, right? A
Yeah.
lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of hassle, and so there's probably some people who could get enough out of doing the same thing in the United States, where maybe it wouldn't be as powerful, or maybe not as many of the people attending such a ceremony would benefit, but there'd probably still likely be some benefits, and the cost saved would probably make up for the difference in benefits, I would say, in a lot of cases. So it's a lot of a case by case decisions, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess if you're already getting leverage on yourself, the possibilities for change are just exponential, right? Like you go to this brand new place you've never been in your life. It's like a vacation
Yeah,
and
that too.
it's a
Yeah.
tropical area. You're like, whoa, you're already in a state where change can affect, it's already affecting you. You're already
Yeah,
changing just by going.
that's a great point. Yeah. And a lot
That's
of these places
interesting.
have you, do certain diet for the month
Yeah.
beforehand. You don't have caffeine or alcohol, and they abstain from sex in a lot of them too. And so those are obviously all going to affect your behavior and your outcomes too, right? So there's a lot more that can often go into those other kinds of retreats. It seems like I don't know a whole lot about the ayahuasca ceremonies going on in Iowa or in the United States so much, but but at least with the ones in the Central and South America, there's a lot of prep and other things that go into it beyond the ayahuasca. Yeah, there's meditation and there's classes on site. You're there for like 7 to 10 days. You meet a bunch of new people. You make friendships. You get to meet the staff, who are very friendly, of course. And so yeah, there's all kinds of things beyond the ayahuasca that are going into those retreats.
It's so amazing. Like when I hear you talk about it, like it brings me back to this idea. Like it's so spiritual in a way. Like you're meeting new people. You're doing something for the first time, a lot of people. And that's almost like a rebirth. It's almost giving you permission to be reborn. And that there's that same nomenclature, and you're a born again Christian, or you're born again, and like they just tie together. So they just fit seamless together in so many ways. And I could understand why that would scare people in some ways, because for some people, religion is very scary. Maybe people have got, you think of Jim Jones, or these people that find themselves in like a cult or something like that. And, it's interesting, but I think that we have to have the courage to try to change. We have to have the courage to at least look deep within ourselves. And if you don't feel right, then there's probably something you need to address. And by not addressing it, you're making it worse. And if these types of experiences will allow us to confront the change, I'm not saying you have to do the change, but if you can confront the change, the threshold guardian, as James Campbell likes to call it, if you can confront him, you got a chance of moving up to the next level. And I really think that that's what's going on in the world of psychedelics. And, as a psychiatrist, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I can also see why people, would be a little bit scared, like you said at the beginning of that, about, dying and being reborn again. Because even if they have issues or problems in their life, there's probably things that they like about themselves too. And they might be scared to lose those things, or like maybe an aspect of themselves that they like might be changed. It's hard to predict before you go through it, what's going to change or not.
That is a great point. How much, in your opinion, how much of the difficulties in life do you think come from people fearing change, whether it's something they think they like about themselves, they know they have to change, but they're holding on to it for some reason? Do you think that that's a big part of, or do you think that that contributes to mental illness?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Holding on to things. I think that's a often a big part of like cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment theory to um, to learn how to let go of things when they need to be let go of. Mindfulness meditation, of course,
Yeah.
kind of tries to address that as well. Yeah, and so I think that is something that underlies a lot of pathology, and that's something that Robin Carr Harris has put forth recently as well. Is that there seems to be a common factor to a lot of different mental illnesses, and maybe that's um, biased habits essentially, which would be kind of be like what you're talking about, where whether it's depression, whether it's substance misuse, whether that's OCD or anorexia, there's people who are very deeply ingrained in certain habits and um, um, not very open to change, I suppose. So it seems like perhaps psychedelics can target all these different types of disorders and such, because they're kind of targeting this common factor of getting people to accept their issues and to um, like you said earlier in the talk, look at their issues from a new perspective and a fresh light.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that brings up an interesting point too. It seems to me that, when you read the studies, and I understand why these restrictions are on studies. There's restrictions like if you have bipolar disease, or if you have schizophrenia, or if you have a history of family mental illness, then maybe the study's not right for you. And I can understand why we want to segregate those people. However, it almost seems like those people might benefit most from psychedelics. So, like, what a weird way to exclude the people that may need it. How do we go about rectifying that?
Yeah, there's so many things to balance, I think, for psychedelic
Yeah.
researchers, and I think that's the main reason those populations were excluded. The first, in this, in the beginnings of the psychedelic renaissance, I should say,
Yeah.
is because there's things that researchers had to balance, which included, making this trials as safe as possible, getting regulatory approval, trying to, just essentially make sure that there were no adverse events and trying to do it, like I said already, as safely as possible. And so I can see why, just out of an abundance of caution, that certain populations might be excluded, and especially because there are case reports of individuals with either schizophrenia or bipolar, in some cases having negative experiences with psychedelics. But there's not really solid research there, to be honest. It's not very concrete. There's some sparse case reports and stuff, but there's not really concrete evidence so far on the relationship between psychedelics and reactions among people with psychotic or bipolar dispositions. And so we're starting to kind of look at that a little bit more now that we've, kind of gradually built up to it by exploring a lot of different vulnerable populations first. So here at UCSF, there's going to be a psilocybin therapy study for bipolar type 2, which is the less severe form of bipolar disorder. So there's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 involves, mania and depression. Type 2 involves hypomania and depression, which is essentially just a less severe, less intense version of mania. And so it makes sense if you're going to start looking at bipolar patients with bipolar, then to start with the type 2 and to see how they respond and move on. And so specifically, the study is going to see if we can target the depressive aspect of their bipolar diagnosis, because we know from other studies that, psilocybin therapy has potential for treating depression. And then we'll see what happens in terms of safety outcomes and other unique things that might come up with this population as we progress very slowly with this very small phase 1 study. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. It's another reason why I'm so excited about this renaissance that we're having and using the different plant medicines is that it seems that, and this is just my speculation, but it seems to me that for a long time, the pharmaceutical industry, which I'm happy they're there, they've created a lot of great things that help a lot of people become better, and I'm thankful for that.
Yeah.
However, it does seem at times that the business model for pharmaceuticals is to sort of a coping strategy. Like if you take something for ADHD, like modafinil or Ritalin, or some sort of stimulant, or something for depression like an SSRI. It seems that these particular medicines allow you to cope with what you have, and it's like, I feel I hate my life, but I take this pill, I can go to work and I can still do my life.
Yeah.
Which is one way to get through it. But what I have found on psychedelics is that, again, you're confronting the problem. And if you look at some of the research with PTSD or depression, you're seeing people take two, sometimes one particular experience and like, oh my God, you know what? I realized I'm a dummy. I realized I'm a dummy, guys. Congratulations. And
Yeah.
I'm a horrible person and I got to fix that. I did it, and you come to this idea of like, oh, it was me the whole, guess what? You just take the mask off. It was me.
Yeah,
I'm here.
mirror to the face. Yeah.
And you're able to figure out what the problem is and at least begin solving. You may not solve it the first time, but at least you can take steps to solving it versus taking a pill that's like, okay, I fucking hate this. Let's go. Just take this thing,
exactly. Just dampens the symptoms temporarily until your next pill time comes. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited for that because I think that is the revolution, or at least one of the avenues that's revolutionizing medicine. Is like, look, this is allowing us to see at least the truth, and the truth will set you free here. And I'm wondering if I think that's a measurable thing, right? Like you can measure someone that has to take a pill forever versus someone that has a objective or a subjective experience and no longer has to do it. That's got to be an experiment in itself some way. What do you think about those two different methodologies?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with the pills, it seems like I don't know. You can blunt the symptoms. You can ignore them. But I think the thing, like you said, with psychedelics is, you confront them head on. And aside from that, improving the clinical symptoms, like you said, it might make people make other changes in their lives that are really important, and make it so that they're not just going to a crappy job because they're blunted and don't feel how bad it is. They have the experience and they actually change that crappy job and they're actually living a more fulfilled life. And
yes,
that's kind of separate from the clinical improvement, but it's also huge and of huge importance to the person. So I think that's really interesting. And in some cases, maybe that would be considered a risk as well, that people would change their careers or change their marital status or change their sexuality in some cases after a psychedelic experience.
Yep.
And most of those people don't know that that's going to happen before going in. And so, that's kind of an arguably underappreciated risk, I think, and something that maybe should be more widely disseminated in like consent forms and to the wider public, that, there could be pretty major life changes that people make as a result of these type of experiences that you would not expect with an SSRI or something like that.
That's a great point. I never
stereotypical lawyer who becomes a painter.
That would make the world better if more lawyers became painters.
Right. That's what I'm saying. In some cases that's probably a good thing. In other cases, maybe it was a bad thing for that individual. But it's, again, kind of a case by case thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they could do both. He could be a lawyer for painters.
Yeah. That's true. That's got to be out there.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me because I do see, and when I take psilocybin, it comes, I found, and I think most people will agree with this, like the onset is on wave, like it comes in waves, like it slowly, like you feel the come up and then you're like, okay, I'm good. And then all of a sudden, like the first wave hits you, everything starts breathing, and then you're down some crazy thought rabbit hole of like, oh man, I knew that thing, or maybe I am an alien, whatever your trip is, and then it kind of backs off and then it comes again. And it almost seems to me that the same way psilocybin affects change in the human individual, so too does change happen on our planet. And like, if you look at the first explosion of psychedelics in like the 60s or the 50s, like maybe that was like the come up and then the first wave. And now like this is the second wave, right? And we're working towards this peak experience. And it just, when I think about it like that, that's another thing that psychedelics makes me do, is it makes me see myself in the entire world around me. And maybe that's the peripersonal space, or maybe that's the eyes being wide open and you can take in a little bit more information and see in the trees breathe. But it really, one of the things seems to be this idea of wholeness, or this return to the one right there. I'm not sure how to explain my thoughts on that, but what do you think is this return to wholeness? Do you see psychedelics making the individual sort of feel like they're one organism with the world, or is that something you've experienced?
Yeah, it seems like it. Yeah, people kind of, like you said at the beginning, kind of are able to take a step back a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just feel more connected, very generally. I saw somebody posted on Twitter the other day about how to describe the changes in time perception of
Oh, that's a
psychedelics.
good one.
And I wish I could quote it perfectly, but it was something like, the sense of the barriers between past, present, and future seem to be eliminated, which seems to be what you're saying. There seems to be this oneness, this wholeness,
Yeah.
that is experienced. Yeah. And I think that wholeness and oneness, yeah, it can have pretty important implications. People often feel disconnected, in psychiatric disorders. And maybe that's one thing helping them clinically improve, is that they suddenly feel a part of something much greater. Same thing with terminal patients who
Mm.
are at the end of their life and have a significant psychedelic experience where, um, you know, beforehand they have this sense of their self dying, this single entity of their self dying. But afterwards, they often have this sense of, no, I'm part of everything. So just this one little part's dying. All these other parts of me are still alive and live on. And so I think that could be very powerful as well. And then, of course, the changes in nature relatedness too probably also connect to those feelings of oneness and connection.
Yeah, that's a whole nother avenue of people, like, especially in a world where the demographics are so many, like 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day. And sometimes I think a lot of the problems we see in this world are a direct reflection of a generation about to die. There's so much anxiety out there, and there's so many, our grandparents and our parents are getting older, and they're on the precipice of having the mortality experience, or whatever you want to call it. They
Sure,
are,
yeah.
they're there. And, that's a whole nother avenue that you're beginning to see people move towards in using psychedelics, is people confronting that. Have you had any experience or heard any about some of these particular trials with psychedelics and end of life?
Not a whole lot personally. Yeah. I've read the papers and I think they're pretty interesting, but yeah, I guess that
Yeah.
hasn't been something I've ever written about, or not something that we're studying in the lab here, surprisingly, because it seems like we're exploring basically every indication possible with psilocybin right now. We have studies with bipolar patients, patients with Parkinson's, depression, substance abuse, possibly. So there's all kinds of directions that the lab is exploding into. But yeah, personally, I guess I don't have a whole lot of expertise in the end of life area.
There's another aspect of it too. I think that, therapy has been good for couples, for individuals, people with mental illness. And in some ways, I think that the use, I think there's been great work done with couples therapy and MDMA.
Yeah.
I also know that, when you are in a psychedelic, on the come down of like a psychedelic, like psilocybin, you tend to get into this philosophical stage where maybe hour 4, hour 5, you're really starting to ask some interesting questions. At least that seems to be a pattern for me. And I'm wondering if, if anybody has begun pioneering, therapy, like talking to people, whether it's sitting down one-on-one or in a group, and talking about the issues that they have. And if so, is there a premier time to do it? Like, it seems to me like the late stages of the coming down period would be the best time to talk to somebody, but maybe some of the programming, or maybe some sort of the conversation could happen in the beginning or the middle. Is there any kind of literature on that?
Not a whole lot of literature, I would say. I would say just in personal experiences, being in the dosing room, that at the peak, people just aren't able to verbalize very much. They're not able to hold conversations. They lose track of what they're talking about very quickly.
Yeah.
Can hardly finish a sentence sometimes. So I don't think that, there's going to be a whole lot of meaningful therapeutic intervention at that point. I think, yeah, it's just hard to communicate. And that's the kind of a central tenet of therapy, is to communicate with each other. But yeah, I definitely think during the beginning stages and the later stages of this experience, when people are able to talk a little bit more, that could be useful. And also, it's a little bit drug dependent as well. So like with something like MDMA, people seem to be a little bit more lucid and a little bit more cogent during the drug experience, and they actually are able to verbalize themselves a little bit better.
Yeah. As we're talking about different kinds of drugs, there seems to be an explosion in ketamine as well, which is a disassociative. Can you maybe help people in the audience explain the difference between something like psilocybin and a disassociative like ketamine?
Yeah, definitely. It's the distinction in the lines between psychedelics and classic psychedelics and other types of hallucinogens is a little blurred, and there's a ton of debate about what to call MDMA and ketamine, whether they're psychedelics, whether they're just hallucinogens, whether they're second generation psychedelics, whether they're atypical psychedelics. It's kind of a open area right now that's still being debated. But ketamine is distinct in its pharmacology compared to the classic psychedelics, and its acute effects. It doesn't have the same affinity for the 5-HT2A receptor that I mentioned before. That's characteristic of the classic psychedelics. Ketamine, it does seem like there definitely are therapeutic benefits, but they don't seem to be as long lasting, it seems like, as with the classic psychedelics, that people tend to need to re-administer the treatment on a more regular basis, as opposed to the psychedelic interventions, which are just a very limited number of times. And ketamine also has a little bit greater potential for abuse as well, so people can get addicted to ketamine in some cases, which is very rare with the classic psychedelics like psilocybin. I've yet to come across the shroom addict, I have to say. I'm sure they're out there, and for some periods, people probably do abuse them. But in terms of comparisons, it's there's much less potential for abuse there, it seems like. So yeah, there's definitely just some distinctions between ketamine and the classic psychedelics and MDMA as well.
So you've written too about what people call Blue Mondays. And for those who may not know, and tell me if I have this wrong, it's this idea that if you take MDMA, like a couple of days later, you kind of feel like all clumsy and stuff like that. And I know that I've fallen victim to that. I don't know if it was a subjective thing that I felt, or maybe you can talk a little bit about that, explain what it is, and then talk a little bit about that paper that you wrote.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like you said, Blue Mondays is this kind of phenomenon that people talk about where they tend to feel blue or depressed in the days after taking MDMA or ecstasy. And this is something that I didn't have a whole lot of familiarity with before doing this paper, but the lead author, Ben Sessa, who's a really big MDMA researcher, great researcher in this area, he had done this pilot study of MDMA therapy for alcohol use disorder, and mentioned that he had collected mood ratings in the days after dosing. And so maybe that could be a way of looking at this potential Blue Mondays phenomenon. And he personally has had this theory for a while, and now that there's a lot more that goes into Blue Mondays than just the MDMA. And so specifically, when people take MDMA recreationally, it's often cut with a number of other substances. And so you're not actually getting pure MDMA in many circumstances. Additionally, many people, when they take MDMA recreationally, they combine it with other drugs and alcohol. And so that also kind of clouds the source of the Blue Mondays. And then lastly, people, when they take MDMA, often also take it at nighttime in very crowded and hot nightlife settings where they're dancing, they're sweating, they're staying up very late, and they're not getting sleep. And so it's kind of not surprising the next days that they're kind of feeling a little blue. And so, yeah, so there's reason to think about how much of these Blue Mondays are specific to MDMA versus how much is it a consequence of the context that MDMA is often taken in. And so, yeah, in the clinical trial, those confounding factors aren't present. They're not taking it at night. They're getting sleep. They're not getting dehydrated. They're getting pure MDMA, and they're not combining it with any other substances. And with that being the case, we found that these participants didn't show signs of Blue Mondays afterwards. And so, that doesn't mean that Blue Mondays don't exist necessarily. This is one study, and it's kind of a small sample as well, but it does kind of support that theory that perhaps there's a lot of other things that go into the Blue Mondays besides the active MDMA.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. It's more of someone just destroying their body versus like that actual one thing. It's probably
right.
all these other things too, It
doesn't, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. Yeah. There's a lot of other things going on typically, but I will say I think the title of that paper probably should have been tempered a little bit. I think we call it debunking the myth of Blue Mondays,
Right.
and like I said a second ago, I think that's a little strong because I think the evidence is still kind of tentative, and there needs to be more research there still. Yeah.
Right. But it's a good attention getter, and it draws in people to like, wait a minute, this is not. Oh, okay, yeah, that's actually kind of right.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what happened. Except the problem is most people don't read the paper, so they just see the headline. They're like, oh, these guys, they don't know what
That's
they're
a
talking
huge
about.
problem in our world. Like I think the majority of people just read headlines of everything, and they never
Yeah,
read the articles or papers. They just go, oh, well, that must be what it is right there.
exactly. Yeah, and it's hard too though because there's
It
just so
is.
much information competing for your attention that you can't click on everything and you can't read everything. So I get why people do that. I do that too, of course.
Of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, that I was talking to someone a while back about the problem of specialization. And it's amazing that we have all these incredible people that are very specialized in searching this one thing. But sometimes it makes it so difficult for the right hand to know what the left hand is doing, because if you're so specialized, you have to be so focused. You're not paying attention to anything else that's happening. You can very easily find yourself down just this weird road of, echo chambers and not in consciously pushing away information that could be relevant. And maybe in some level maybe psychedelics could be an answer to that. Maybe that opens people up and opens up their mind. And if it does remove memory from perception, then maybe that's a way to kind of bring us back together. But it's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, and it's harder. It's becoming harder and harder to avoid. With these algorithms kind of picking what we're exposed to now. It's harder to go out of your way to get exposed to things that you wouldn't otherwise, because you're constantly being shown things that are being picked for you, essentially. It's just a really new and interesting phenomenon. Yeah.
So in San Francisco, have you guys decriminalized psilocybin over there?
I believe that happened last year. Yeah, I live in Berkeley, actually, just outside in the
Nice.
East Bay. But I remember that they were talking about it or going to vote. I'm pretty sure that it happened. Yeah. And in Oakland, it's decriminalized, and I think Berkeley was going to vote on decriminalizing very soon or recently too. So it's kind of the whole Bay Area has kind of been getting on that train.
Yeah, it seems I'm curious to get to see the effects of it. I know in Colorado they have Prop 122 and they've decriminalized it, and there's these weird sort of avenues where you can give somebody psilocybin or you can sit with them while they have a trip, but there's still some interesting parameters around it that people are trying to figure out how to get things done. But I think it does create a space for people to begin exploring and hopefully navigating doing some of their own people that are, and this is obviously not for everybody, but for some people, maybe you can begin to explore your own consciousness and explore your own problems a little bit if you feel comfortable doing it. How do you see legalization playing out? Is it a benefit, or is it maybe something that could be hindering the long-term pathway for psychedelics?
Yeah, it's another good question. I've mixed feelings about it, I suppose. On one hand, it seems like things have been moving along very smoothly for psychedelic science, right? In terms of the regulatory pipeline, things are just going along smoothly as possible. MDMA's just had its phase 3 trials finished. It seems like it's going to be approved next year. Psilocybin, the phase 2 studies, at least USONA's just finished getting data collection. And there's obviously lots of good publicity around psychedelics right now. People are really excited. There's a lot of just hope around psychedelics right now. And so, on one part of me is like, why mess with a good thing? Why jump the gun? But at the same time, there's people that can't afford to wait. There's people who are dying every day from these disorders. And every day that we wait to do that, there's going to be more people that die. And so, it's a hard thing to balance. I think that there's enough evidence out there now that's pretty compelling that I can see why people would, want to start experimenting with these types of therapies on their own. Oh, you got a cat there?
Yeah. What's up, Freddie? He loves. He heard us talking about psychedelics.
I got Rita here.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah. They're super awesome. I love they're little beasts, but I love them. They jump on the table. Yeah.
Yeah, they're great little friends and low maintenance pets. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. They're fun to be around and stuff. What,
Yeah.
you know what? I had another question for you. When does it seems to me that it's incredibly difficult to thoroughly understand the psychedelic content in a mushrooms. Like how do you measure the psilocybin or how do you measure the psilocin in there? And is that, are people using like 4-ACO-DMT or psilocin in the studies? Is that way they can measure it, or do you know what's going on in those ways? Or people just, because you could have an eighth of mushrooms, but it could be totally different than this eighth of mushrooms. It seems, how are people measuring that? Are they using straight, psilocin in there, or what's going on there?
Yeah. So yeah, so most studies have been using psilocybin in their studies, the actual psilocybin
Okay.
molecule, which, like you said, can vary between mushrooms. So even within the same grow, one mushroom will have a certain
Right.
concentration of psilocybin, another will have another, and you don't really know which is going to be which without actually doing some kind of chemical analysis, which and most people aren't going to do. Um, and it's just not a very clean method of drug administration,
Right.
and so that's why we use the psilocybin molecule itself instead of giving people fungi. Yeah.
Yeah.
um, but the problem is that that's still not perfectly clean. I don't know exactly how they isolate the psilocybin from the mushrooms or make it synthetically, in the
Right.
lab. That's, I guess, just a level of biochemistry I'm not very familiar with. Um, but yeah, like I said, I do know that they're using the psilocybin molecule in most studies. The exception would actually be the study I'm leading right now, which is
Nice.
just a study comparing different methods of administering psilocybin and psilocin. So what we're doing is we're having 20 healthy participants go through 4 dosing sessions. Each dosing session is about a month apart. And in one of the dosing sessions, they're going to receive 25 milligrams of oral psilocybin, which is the typical dosing method that everybody's doing right now. It's a pill that has 25 milligrams. It's pretty much the standard dose. And we're going to be comparing that with a pill of oral psilocin, as
Mm.
well as 2 sublingual doses of psilocin. And the reason we want to use psilocin is that there are differences in how people metabolize psilocybin into psilocin. And psilocybin itself actually isn't psychoactive. It has to be converted into psilocin to be able to attach to those 2A receptors. And so when you eat mushrooms typically, or take a pill of psilocybin, it goes into the stomach, and a phosphate group gets removed and that gets converted into psilocin. And then psilocin actually goes to the bloodstream and is able to attach to those receptors in the brain. There's differences in how people metabolize psilocybin into psilocin, meaning 2 people given the exact same amount of psilocybin, even if it's 25 milligram pill, are going to have different amounts of psilocin in the brain because of their differences in how they metabolize it.
Mm-hmm.
And also they're going to have different amounts of psilocin at different time courses. And so for the same reason that that we prefer the oral pill of psilocybin over the mushrooms, it would be ideal to have the psilocin over the oral pill of psilocybin, because again, we're just kind of refining the dosing and making it a little bit cleaner, and making it a little bit more consistent between individuals. Because right now, like I said, if you give 2 people 25 milligrams of oral psilocybin, they're not going to have the same amount of psilocin. So it'd be ideal if you could have a more predictable method of dosing somebody where people respond more consistently to a certain dose, because they're not having those differences in how they metabolize the drug. And so the reason people, that obviously raises the question, why haven't people just been using psilocin all along? That makes more sense than if you can just do that. And the problem is it's very hard to make a stable version of psilocin.
Yeah.
So it degrades very rapidly. But the company that's funding our study, Filament Health, has developed this patented formulation of psilocin that is much more stable, and that you could actually keep in a pill bottle and it would not degrade very quickly. The last thing that's kind of notable is that the psilocybin and psilocin in our study is actually taken from real mushrooms that they grew in a laboratory. And all these other studies, there's no real mushrooms ever involved. They're just making the psilocybin in a test tube, essentially, in a lab with other ingredients. Essentially, they don't actually need the mushrooms to do that. So yeah, there's a couple unique things about that study, but the main thing is that we're thinking that psilocin will result in more consistent effects between individuals because we're removing the individual variability and how they metabolize it. And then also because we're removing that period where they need to convert psilocybin into psilocin, we're anticipating faster onset effects and a shorter experience essentially, and which would be kind of clinically helpful because it would save money and time by cutting down the duration of the trip a little bit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so here's another question I have for your study that might be worthwhile. I was asking the question to a few people, like, why does the psilocybin trip come in waves like that? And the best answer I got is, well, that's how it's metabolized. So it metabolizes and then a wave comes, and it metabolizes and then a wave comes. So if you have psilocin, I wonder if the frequency in between waves would change versus psilocybin, because maybe that is breaking down that phosphate, and then you're getting that another push to the receptors. But if it's more of a clean straight there, maybe the frequency in which the waves come would change. I wonder if that would be worth documenting in there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never thought about that. I've been familiar with this idea of there being waves to the experience. Right. Yeah, definitely have heard that from a number of individuals. Never really thought about what might be underlying that though, but I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Metabolization, right? Because that makes this, it's like, oh, you take, and that is also why, like, if you read the literature from some people that I really enjoy reading say diet is everything. If you do it on an empty stomach, the intensity is going to be better. That seems to me metabolization, and so, the stronger the trip, for me anyways, and these are all subjective, but the most intense experiences I've had were eating like a diet high in bananas for like a couple of days, abstaining from sex, which is also keeping the neurotransmitters in there, and then almost fasting a little bit. And that just means instant metabolization. That's what it sounds like to me. So I'm curious if that could at least be a reason for the waves, and if so, might psilocin cut down or intensify the frequency or change the frequency of waves on there or something. But yeah, I would love to know that.
Yeah, I would love to too. I think the first step to uncovering that is just to figure out how to measure waves essentially. How do we quantify that? Because that's the first thing you have to do, is you have to be able to measure that somehow.
Do you think pupil dilation? Like, I don't know, like maybe some sort of, maybe you might be able to measure, do your pupils dilate when the trip gets stronger, or is that just a factor of light? Or I think on some level, I try to go into my trips with my phone now, and like, I'll do like a recording of like, and no one wants to hear these, but but I mean, but you can begin to start talking about like rapid onset ideas, or at least, okay, now I'm back. You know what I mean? Like you could begin to measure it in some weird way.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah. That's an interesting study idea to have people do that throughout their trip. And obviously they can't write things down very well. I know a lot of people try, but when you look at the writings later, it doesn't make sense, or it's just jumbled or whatever.
Or you don't have a pen there, or you're at that point in time, you're like, I don't want to look at this notebook. But if your phone is always on record, you can begin, like, that's something that I've always tried to do is I think that the at least for me, one of the goals is to bring something back from that place, something that you can share with people. And a lot of times you come back with gibberish, but every now and then you can bring something back that is this shiny object that you could show people, like, look at this thing that I found.
Look
at this idea,
Exactly. Reminds me of kind of just a little funny story. Paul McCartney, the first time he took LSD, he thought, the next day he said, I remember learning the secret to life and I wrote it down. And he went and looked at the piece of paper and it said, there are 7 levels, I think is all it said. He could not figure it out, but he was like so sure when he wrote that down that he had figured out the meaning of life.
Yeah. And like, I think that, I don't think that's uncommon. Like, I think all of us who have gone through big doses are like, I get it. Exactly. I totally get it. And then you come back and all you have is the remembrance of understanding.
Yeah.
And maybe that's all we're afforded.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes that's enough, right? It's enough to know that you had that experience. It's like MLK's I've been to the mountaintop, or the burning bush. Like, you've had this transcendental moment of knowing. So you know it's there, and it almost brings us back to faith. It's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
It's so amazing, Jake. I'm having an absolute blast, my friend. I got a hard out coming up, but I feel like I could talk
Yeah,
to
I
you
do
for like
too,
another
actually, coming soon. So I was
couple
gonna say
hours.
that works
Yeah.
well. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say I would love to come back. I think I could continue this conversation for all day too. Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we go, where can people find you? What do you got coming up, and what are you excited about?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty active on the academic Twitter space and psychedelic space. Try to post all of our articles there and provide some updates on our ongoing studies every now and then there too. Also, you can find a lot of my papers on ResearchGate. Just if you could Google my name, Jacob Aday, ResearchGate, you should be able to find that. And our lab website is psychedelics.ucsf.edu, so very easy to remember. If you want to see, studies that you might be able to enroll in, or just exactly what we're up to right now. And yeah, I'm hoping to make it to the Psychedelic Science Conference next summer. I think that's the big psychedelic gathering that'll be at. So hope to see you there too.
Yeah, I got my next one of my next things is start traveling a little bit. So that's hopefully I'll be able to do that in the next year or so. So
Awesome.
fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I will put Jake's information in the show notes. Reach out to him if you have some good ideas, or you want to talk, or you want to read some of his papers. I highly suggest him. He's got a bunch of them out there. They're all very interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're writing papers, or if you're into psychedelics, reach out to me on the True Life podcast. Reach out to Jake. Let's amplify the good ideas out there and make this a place of change. And that's all we got for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Aloha.